So, this is week 3 of environmental ethics, and during this week we have one reading. It is from Christopher Stone. It is called Should Trees Have Standing Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects? A couple of things I want to say with regards to this text before we read it to help orient you to it and to help you make sense of it. The first thing is this is not a philosophical text necessarily. It's not a text published in a journal of philosophy, for example. It is rather a text that was written originally for and published in a journal of legal studies. So it is a text written from the perspective of law. But as you know, law and ethics are closely related. And something happens in this essay that I think is really important for us. It's a very historically important essay that comes in 1972, in which Chris Stone makes the argument that the notion of personhood, which is a legal category, should be extended to natural objects like trees. Now, if you remember from the readings that we did previously, especially Aldo Leopold's Land Ethic, there's a way in which the concept of personhood, the idea of being a moral or legal person, has evolved over time. Initially, personhood was restricted to male heads of the household. So, for example, in Leopold's text, he begins with a little story from the Odyssey where Odysseus returns home from the wars in Troy. And the first thing he does is hang all the slave girls because he suspects them of misbehavior while he was gone. And Leopold points out that at the time that Odysseus does this, it's not considered a wrong activity. You can kill your slaves. And you can kill your slaves because they are not persons, they are property. And so there's a very strong division between who's a person and what is property. And during the time of the ancient Greeks, especially the time at which Odysseus supposedly lived, it was only the male head of the household who would have been considered a moral and legal subject. Therefore, his slaves, his wife, and his children would all be considered property that he could dispose of as he wished, and there was no legal impropriety in doing so. Over time, both ethics and legal status has evolved in such a way that we've extended the rights of persons to a lot of these individuals who were previously excluded. So, for example, by the middle of the 19th century in the United States, we recognized that finally slaves had the rights of persons, and the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln was a executive order that said, the individuals who were enslaved and brought to the United States from Africa as slaves would, from that point forward, be free and be recognized as full persons. The same occurs with women, who for many years in the European tradition were considered the property of their husbands, and it isn't until very late in human history, at least from our perspective, that women gain the right to vote and gain the right to inherit property, and therefore become full citizens and full persons before the law. So Stone's argument is, if this is the way that morality has grown, we've evolved in such a way that the circle of inclusion has become wider and wider, bringing into it more and more individuals who were previously excluded, there's a way in which we can use this argument of personhood to begin to protect other things, not just human beings. So, for example, we now recognize the rights of personhood for some animals. The most recent version of this comes from the Indian Supreme Court in India, where they have recognized that dolphins are people. And as a result, you can no longer hold dolphins in captivity because it is considered to be cruel, and it would be considered like holding you or I in captivity. Recently, the government in New Zealand, through their Supreme Court, has recognized a river as having the status of a person. And therefore, this river would be granted the same rights as a person would be in the law of New Zealand. So Chris Stone is the guy who really begins this effort to extend personhood to natural objects in this essay from 1972. And so for this week, the third week of environmental ethics, we're going to be reading this historic essay that really developed a new thinking about protecting the environment and a new strategy for working with the protections of personhood for non-natural objects, non-biological objects. In other words, like rivers and soils, and things related to this. So as you read the Stone article, I want you not only to look at it as a argument to provide legal protections to natural objects, but I also want you to question the philosophical assumptions that Stone makes and the sort of logic behind his argument to try to assess it critically and gain some perspective on its persuasiveness and whether or not you would agree or disagree with this as a strategy for environmental activism and various forms of protection. So that's all I have. Enjoy the essay, and I again have questions for you to read. As you work through the essay, I'd say, have these questions in mind and then record your answers in your notebook or in your reading journal. All right, thanks. See you later.